The sun was barely peeking over the rooftops when the garbage truck rumbled down Maple Street. It was just after 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, and most folks in Riverside Heights were still sipping their first cup of coffee. Behind the wheel sat Andrew, a hard-working man with kind eyes and a patient smile. At 34, he'd been collecting trash in this neighborhood for almost 10 years now, long enough to know which houses had friendly dogs and which residents might offer him a cold drink on hot summer days. Andrew pulled his truck alongside the Peterson house, noticing right away that something wasn't right. The wind had been strong overnight, and someone's trash can had tipped over, scattering garbage across the neat front lawn. Without hesitation, he put the truck in park, turned on his hazards, and hopped out. This wasn't technically part of his job description, but Andrew didn't think twice about it. That's just the kind of person he was. Better clean this up before the wind blows it all over the neighborhood, he muttered to himself, grabbing a pair of thick gloves from his back pocket. As Andrew began picking up soaked newspapers and empty food containers, he didn't notice the young woman approaching from down the street. She was walking a fluffy golden retriever who seemed more interested in sniffing every inch of the sidewalk than making progress on their morning walk. "Need some help with that?" called a friendly voice. Andrew looked up to see a college-aged girl with a bright smile. She was home for summer break. He could tell by the university sweatshirt she wore despite the warm morning. "That's real nice of you to offer," Andrew replied, "but I've got it under control. Don't want you getting your hands dirty." The girl, let's call her Lily, tied her dog's leash to a nearby mailbox and walked over anyway. "I don't mind at all. My hands wash, you know." She picked up an empty cereal box and a couple of crushed soda cans. "I'm Lily, by the way. My parents live over on Oak Street." "Andrew," he said with a nod. "Been working this route for years now. I think I've seen your folks' place, the blue house with all the flower pots on the porch." Lily laughed. "That's my mom's doing. She thinks she's got a green thumb, but between you and me, half those plants are plastic." They chatted easily as they worked, talking about the weather, about how Lily was studying environmental science, and how Andrew's son had just started high school. It was a simple, friendly conversation between two neighbors helping to keep their community clean. Neither of them paid any attention to the woman watching from across the street. Nancy Winters stood at her bay window, coffee cup forgotten in her hand, phone in the other. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the garbage man talking with the young girl. In Nancy's mind, something wasn't right. Why would a sanitation worker stop his route to talk to a college girl? What was he really doing in front of the Peterson house when the Petersons were known to put their trash out on Wednesday, not Tuesday? Nancy had lived in Riverside Heights for 15 years. She was on the Homeowners Association board and took pride in keeping the neighborhood up to standards. That meant reporting unkempt lawns, unauthorized paint colors, and, in her mind, suspicious characters who didn't belong. She couldn't hear what Andrew and Lily were saying, but she didn't need to. Nancy had already decided something was wrong. The friendly conversation appeared threatening through her prejudiced eyes. The helpful act of cleaning up trash became loitering. The morning chat transformed into something sinister. Nancy's finger hovered over her phone screen. Should she call? Was she overreacting? For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Then she saw Andrew laugh at something Lily said, and that was enough to push Nancy over the edge. She dialed 911, her voice dropping to a whisper even though no one could hear her. "Yes, hello? I need to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. There's a garbage man who stopped his truck, and he's talking to a young girl. She looks uncomfortable. I'm worried about her safety. Please send someone quickly." As she spoke, Nancy kept her eyes fixed on the scene across the street, where Andrew and Lily were finishing cleaning up the scattered trash, completely unaware that their simple act of community kindness was about to be interrupted in the worst way. Nancy paced in her living room, phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart was racing. She kept glancing out the window to make sure Andrew and Lily were still there. They were, still picking up the last bits of trash, still talking and smiling as if nothing was wrong. To Nancy, their everyday friendliness looked suspicious. "The dispatcher said officers are on their way," she muttered to herself, pulling back her curtain for a better view. "Someone needs to protect that poor girl." Nancy had always seen herself as the neighborhood's unofficial guardian, When the Thompsons painted their fence a slightly darker shade of brown than the HOA guidelines allowed, Nancy was the first to file a complaint. When Mr. Garcia's son had friends over who played music past 9 p.m., Nancy made sure everyone at the next community meeting knew about it. But this was different. This wasn't about property values or noise. In her mind, this was about safety. She rehearsed what she would tell the police when they arrived. I saw him stop his truck where he shouldn't be. The girl looked uncomfortable. I was worried for her safety. Nancy repeated these phrases to herself, becoming more convinced with each repetition that she was doing the right thing. Across the street, Andrew and Lily had just finished cleaning up the mess. The lawn was spotless again, and both were feeling good about their small act of kindness. "Thanks for the help," Andrew said, removing his work gloves. "Wasn't expecting anybody to jump in like that." Lily smiled and shrugged. "No big deal. My professor always says small actions add up to big changes. Guess that applies to trash too." "Your professor sounds smart," Andrew laughed. "Well, I better get back to my route before my supervisor starts wondering where I am." "It was nice meeting you," Lily called as she untied her dog's leash from the mailbox. The golden retriever had settled down for a nap during their cleanup effort and looked mildly annoyed at being disturbed. That's when they heard the sound of sirens in the distance. At first, neither thought much of it. Police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks were common enough sounds in any neighborhood. But then the sirens grew louder, and a moment later, 2 police cruisers turned onto Maple Street, red and blue lights flashing. Nancy watched from her window as the police cars pulled up. A surge of satisfaction swept through her. Finally, she whispered, "Someone's taking action." The police cars stopped near Andrew's garbage truck. 2 officers stepped out, Officer Rivera and Officer Chen. They assessed the situation briefly before approaching Andrew and Lily, who stood frozen in confusion. Nancy grabbed her phone and house keys, then hurried outside. She wasn't going to miss this. As she crossed the street with purposeful strides, she could hear Officer Rivera speaking. "Good morning, folks. We received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Mind if we ask what's going on here?" Before Andrew could answer, Lily spoke up, her face showing confusion. "Suspicious person? We were just picking up some trash that had blown over." Nancy reached the group, slightly out of breath from rushing across the street. "Officers, I'm the one who called. I saw this man stop his truck and approach this young lady. I was concerned for her safety." Andrew's expression shifted from confusion to something deeper, a look of tired recognition. He'd been here before, been seen as suspicious before, simply for existing in spaces others thought he shouldn't. Lily turned to Nancy, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Wait, you called the police because he was helping clean up garbage? Are you serious?" "I was just looking out for you, dear," Nancy said, her voice sugar sweet but her eyes darting between the officers, seeking their validation. A young girl alone, approached by a stranger, anyone would be concerned. Officer Chen glanced at Andrew's clearly marked sanitation department uniform, then at the garbage truck with the city logo prominently displayed on its side. His expression remained professional, but a slight furrow appeared between his brows. "Ma'am," he addressed Nancy, "you reported a suspicious person. Can you clarify what exactly you found suspicious about this city employee doing his job?" The question hung in the air as neighbors began to emerge from their homes, curious about the police presence on their quiet street. Nancy stood her ground, chin lifted, unaware that her moment of righteous intervention was about to unravel in ways she hadn't anticipated. The red and blue lights from the police cars bounced off the houses along Maple Street, turning an ordinary Tuesday morning into something that felt like a scene from a TV drama. More neighbors had started coming outside now. Some stood on their porches, while others slowly moved closer to the growing crowd around Andrew, Lily, Nancy, and the 2 police officers. "I'm just doing my job," Andrew said calmly to Officer Rivera, though his shoulders were tense. "I saw some trash had spilled, so I stopped to clean it up. It's not part of my official duties, but I don't like leaving neighborhoods messy if I can help it." Officer Rivera nodded, making notes. Andrew had dealt with situations like this before. He knew to keep his voice steady, his hands visible, and his explanation simple. It wasn't his first time being treated like he didn't belong somewhere. "And you?" Officer Chen turned to Lily, who was still holding her dog's leash tightly. "I was just walking my dog," Lily explained, her voice rising with frustration. "I saw him cleaning up the mess and offered to help. We were having a normal conversation. That's literally all that happened." Nancy stepped forward, adjusting her cardigan as if preparing for an important presentation. "Officers, I saw this man stop his truck and approach this young woman. She looked uncomfortable. I was worried." "Uncomfortable?" Lily's eyes widened. "I wasn't uncomfortable. We were talking about my mom's plans and his son's first day of high school. How exactly did I look uncomfortable from across the street through your window?" An older man with gray hair and a morning newspaper tucked under his arm approached the group. It was Mr. Wilson, who had lived on Maple Street longer than anyone else. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from face to face. "This lady called the cops on Andra because he was picking up trash," Lily explained, gesturing toward Nancy. Mr. Wilson's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Andra?" "Our garbage man. The one who helped push my car out of a snowbank last winter." Nancy's face flushed slightly, but she stood firm. "I was just being vigilant. You can't be too careful these days." By now, more neighbors had joined the circle. Mrs. Puttle from 3 doors down recognized Lily immediately. "Lily, how are your parents? Is your mother still trying to grow those tomatoes?" Mrs. Patel asked, momentarily forgetting the tense situation. "They're fine, Mrs. Puttle," Lily answered with a tight smile. "And yes, Mom's still killing tomato plants by the dozen." Officer Rivera looked around at the gathering crowd. "So it seems like both of you are well known in the neighborhood." "Andra's been our sanitation worker for years," Mr. Wilson confirmed. "Best one we've had. Always goes the extra mile. Last Christmas, my grandson left his new toy outside by accident, and Andra found it and brought it to the door instead of assuming it was trash." "And the Hendersons have lived on Oak Street since Lily was in elementary school," Mrs. Patel added. "She used to babysit my kids." Nancy's righteous expression began to falter. This wasn't going the way she had planned. She had expected the officers to thank her for her vigilance, maybe even commend her for keeping the neighborhood safe. Instead, she was facing a crowd of neighbors who clearly didn't share her concerns. "Look," Officer Chen said, closing his notepad. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding here." "A misunderstanding?" Lily wasn't ready to let it go so easily. She called the police on a man for doing his job and being nice. That's not a misunderstanding. That's... She trailed off, struggling to find words that weren't too harsh. Andra, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke up. "It's profiling," he said simply. "Let's call it what it is." The word hung in the air. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Nancy's face reddened further. "I was not profiling. I was being cautious. Anyone would have done the same thing." "Would you have called if it was Mr. Wilson talking to Lily?" Andra asked quietly. The question was met with silence. Even the officers exchanged a glance. "I think we've established there's no emergency here," Officer Rivera finally said. "Andra, you're free to continue your route. Lily, enjoy your walk." But as the officers turned to leave, a voice called out from the back of the gathered crowd. "Wait a minute," said a tall woman in a business suit, her coffee still in hand, as if she'd rushed out in the middle of a work-from-home meeting. "This isn't right. We can't just pretend this didn't happen." The woman stepped forward, and everyone recognized Dr. Thompson, the new head of the neighborhood association. "Nancy," Dr. Thompson said firmly, "we need to talk about this." "All of us do." Dr. Thompson's words seemed to change the air around them. The neighbors, who moments before had been a scattered audience, now formed a circle. Nancy stood in the middle, her lips pressed into a thin line. She'd known Dr. Thompson for years. They'd served on community committees together, but she'd never seen her look so disappointed. "This isn't the first time," a voice called out from the crowd. It was Mr. Garcia, who lived at the corner house. "Last month, Nancy called security on my nephew when he was helping me move furniture. Said he looked like he might be stealing things." Murmurs rippled through the group. Andra shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at his watch. He was already behind on his route, but something told him he needed to stay. "Is that true, Nancy?" Dr. Thompson asked, her voice level but firm. Nancy's face flushed deeper. He was carrying a TV out of the house. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to think that maybe, just maybe, he belonged there, Mr. Garcia said, his voice tired rather than angry. Just like Andrew belongs on this street, doing his job. Officer Chen cleared his throat. False reports tie up police resources that could be used for actual emergencies, he explained. We take calls about suspicious persons seriously, but we also need citizens to use good judgment. Good judgment, Lily repeated, her voice rising. Like not assuming someone is dangerous just because of how they look. The officers exchanged glances. These were delicate waters to navigate. Look, Officer Rivera said, no charges are being filed here. But I do think there's a community conversation that needs to happen. Oh, it's happening all right, Dr. Thompson said. She turned to address the neighbors who had gathered. I'm calling an emergency neighborhood association meeting for tomorrow evening at the community center. I expect everyone to be there, especially you, Nancy. Nancy's posture stiffened. This is ridiculous. I was trying to protect our neighborhood. From who? Andrew finally asked. His voice was quiet, but somehow it carried more weight than if he had shouted. From me? A guy in a city uniform, driving a city truck, who's been coming to this neighborhood every Tuesday for nearly 10 years. The question hung in the air. A few neighbors looked down at their feet. Others nodded slightly. An older woman stepped forward, Mrs. Chen, who made the best apple pies on the block and always had a kind word for everyone. Anda, she said gently, I'm so sorry this happened. You've always been so kind to everyone here. Last winter, you helped shovel my walkway when my arthritis was acting up. And you found my daughter's teddy bear when it fell into the recycling bin, added another neighbor. You always wave to my kids when they're waiting for the school bus, said someone else. With each new voice, the picture became clearer. Andrew wasn't just the garbage man who came to Riverside Heights. He was part of their community. Someone who had shown kindness to many of them, often going beyond what his job required. Nancy's certainty began to visibly crumble as she listened. She looked around at her neighbors, seeing disappointment and anger in many of their faces. She started, then stopped. For the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. I think, Dr. Thompson said into the silence, that we all need to take some time to reflect on what happened here today, and on what kind of community we want to be. Officer Chen nodded. We'll need to file a report about this incident, but as my partner said, no charges are being pressed at this time. I have to get back to my route, Andrew said, gesturing toward his truck. My supervisor's probably wondering where I am. Wait, Lally said, pulling out her phone. Can I get your number? I want to make sure you're invited to the meeting tomorrow. Your voice should be heard. Andrew hesitated, then nodded. They exchanged numbers quickly. As the crowd began to disperse, Nancy stood alone, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked almost like shock. Dr. Thompson approached her, speaking too quietly for others to hear. Nancy nodded mechanically a few times, then turned and walked slowly back toward her house. The police officers returned to their cruisers, the lights no longer flashing. Neighbors drifted back to their morning routines, though many lingered in small groups, talking in low voices about what they'd witnessed. Andrew climbed back into his truck, sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, then started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Lily stood on the sidewalk, watching him go, her golden retriever sitting patiently at her feet. Tomorrow's meeting would be interesting. For the first time in a long while, Andrew felt like his voice might actually be heard. The community center buzzed with voices as neighbors filed in for the emergency meeting. Folding chairs had been arranged in a large circle rather than the usual rows facing the front. Dr. Thompson had been clear, this wasn't going to be a regular neighborhood association meeting with announcements and committee reports. This was a conversation. Andrew arrived a few minutes early, dressed in jeans and a button-up shirt instead of his work uniform. He hesitated at the entrance, wondering if he should have come at all. This wasn't even his neighborhood. He just worked here. But then he spotted Lily waving from across the room, and he made his way over. Thanks for coming, she said. I wasn't sure you would. Almost didn't, Andrew admitted. Not exactly how I planned to spend my evening. More neighbors arrived, filling the seats until there were nearly 40 people in the room. Mr. Garcia nodded to Andra from across the circle. Mrs. Partal stopped by to introduce her husband. The Wilsons brought cookies. It felt almost like a community gathering rather than the tense meeting Andra had expected. Nancy was the last to arrive. She entered quietly, her usual confident stride replaced by something more cautious. Her gaze swept the room, noting the many eyes that turned to watch her. She chose a seat on the far side from Andra and Lily. "Thank you all for coming," Dr. Thompson began, standing in the center of the circle. "I think we all know why we're here. Yesterday morning, an incident occurred that left many of us feeling troubled and concerned. It's raised questions about safety, judgment, and how we treat one another in this community." She turned slowly, making eye contact with different people around the circle. "Rather than me telling you what happened, I think it's important we hear directly from those involved. Andra, would you be willing to share your perspective?" Andra hadn't expected to speak first. He cleared his throat, feeling all eyes turned to him. "I was just doing my job," he began, his deep voice steady but quiet. "I saw some trash had spilled on the lawn at the Peterson place, and I stopped to clean it up. Been working this route for almost 10 years now. I know most of the houses, most of the folks." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lily came by, offered to help. We talked while we cleaned up, normal stuff, weather, family, nothing special. Next thing I know, police cars are pulling up. At first, I thought something had happened somewhere else in the neighborhood. Then I realized they were there for me." His voice remained calm, but his eyes showed the weight of the experience. "It's not the first time someone's looked at me and seen something to fear instead of just a person doing his job. But it was the first time it happened here, on this route, with people I thought knew me." A heavy silence filled the room when he finished. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Lily," Dr. Thompson prompted, "would you like to add anything?" Lily nodded. "I was just walking my dog, saw Andra picking up trash, and stopped to help. That's it. We were having a normal, friendly conversation when the police showed up. And then to find out someone had called because they thought I was in danger." She shook her head. "It was humiliating for me, but especially for Andra." Dr. Thompson turned toward Nancy. "Nancy, would you be willing to share what you were thinking when you made that call?" All eyes shifted to Nancy, who sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse to speak. Then she straightened her shoulders. "I saw a man I didn't recognize stopping his truck where it shouldn't be stopped," she said, her voice higher than usual. "I saw him talking to a young woman. I was concerned." "But you've seen Andra on this route before," Mrs. Wilson pointed out gently. "He's been our sanitation worker for years." Nancy's lips tightened. "I didn't recognize him specifically. I saw the uniform, yes, but I didn't know him personally." "Would you have called if it had been a white garbage man talking to Lily?" Mr. Garcia asked directly. The room grew even quieter. "That's not fair," Nancy protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "This isn't about." "It is about that," Andra interrupted, not unkindly. "It's exactly about that. And pretending it isn't just makes it worse." Dr. Thompson stepped in. "I think what we're trying to do here is understand, not attack. Nancy, can you help us understand what specific behaviors made you concerned enough to call 911 rather than just watching for a few minutes or asking a neighbor?" Nancy looked around the circle, finding few sympathetic faces. "I've always been told if you see something, say something," she said defensively. "With all the stories on the news, what stories?" Lily pressed. "Stories about garbage men cleaning up trash and chatting with neighbors." An older gentleman who hadn't spoken yet raised his hand. It was Mr. Reynolds, a retired school principal. "I think we're missing something important here," he said. "The issue isn't just what Nancy did. It's about the assumptions many of us make without even realizing it." He looked around the circle. How many of us have crossed the street when we see certain people coming? How many of us have clutched our bags tighter in certain situations? We may not call the police, but we make assumptions too. His words landed heavily in the room. Several people nodded slowly, reluctantly. "The difference," Andra said, "is that those assumptions don't usually end with someone having police lights flashing behind them just for doing their job." Dr. Thompson nodded. "I think that's the heart of what we need to address. How do we become a community where everyone is seen as a person first, not as a threat? Where we use good judgment before involving authorities in situations that don't warrant it? As the conversation continued, something began to shift in the room. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the kind of community they wanted to build together. The community meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. What had started as a response to a single incident gradually evolved into something deeper, a genuine conversation about assumptions, safety, and what it meant to be a good neighbor. By the end, people who had barely nodded to each other before were exchanging phone numbers and making plans. But for Nancy, the meeting had been 3 hours of growing discomfort. As story after story emerged, not just about Andrew's kindness, but about similar experiences other residents and their family members had faced, the weight of what she had done pressed heavier on her shoulders. When the meeting finally ended, people lingered in small groups talking. Nancy gathered her purse and jacket, keeping her eyes down as she headed for the door. She just wanted to get home, away from all the disappointed looks and whispered conversations. Nancy, wait. She turned to find Dr. Thompson following her. I'm tired, Nancy said. I think I've had enough for one night. Dr. Thompson nodded sympathetically. I understand. But before you go, the Neighborhood Association Board has made a decision we wanted to share with you directly. Nancy tensed. She'd been on that board for 8 years. We're asking you to step down from your position, Dr. Thompson said, her voice gentle but firm. Given what we've learned about this incident and others, we feel it's the right thing for the community. Nancy's face flushed hot. You're removing me. After all my years of service? I've organized every summer block party, led the beautification committee, managed the neighborhood watch. And we appreciate those contributions, Dr. Thompson interrupted. But being on the board means representing everyone in this community, not just the people you feel comfortable with. Nancy opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. The fight seemed to drain out of her. Fine, she said flatly, if that's what you've decided. There's something else, Dr. Thompson added. The city has a new community relations program. Part of it involves education about bias and community policing. They're looking for volunteers to help develop it. Nancy frowned. And you want me to what? Be their example of what not to do. Actually, we thought you might want to participate. Learn alongside community members and police officers. Help create something positive from this experience. Nancy stared at her in disbelief. You think I need training on how not to be prejudiced? I think we all do, Dr. Thompson replied simply, including me. Across the room, Andrew was saying goodbye to several neighbors who had shared their phone numbers and told him to call if he ever needed anything. The sincerity was touching, if a bit overwhelming. He wasn't used to this much attention. So, how are you feeling? Lily asked, approaching as the other neighbors moved away. Andrew considered the question. Honestly, mixed. It's good to see people care, but it took all this to make it happen, Lily finished. Exactly. He glanced toward the door, where Nancy was still talking with Dr. Thompson. What about her? Lily followed his gaze. I don't know. People don't change overnight. No, Andrew agreed. They don't. As they watched, Nancy nodded stiffly to whatever Dr. Thompson was saying, then turned and walked out the door. The next morning, Andrew started his route earlier than usual. He had fallen behind yesterday and needed to catch up. As he drove down Maple Street, he noticed something unusual outside Nancy's house. Her trash cans were at the curb, neatly lined up, even though it wasn't collection day for her side of the street. He slowed the truck, puzzled. Then he spotted a folded piece of paper taped to one of the cans. His name was written on the outside. Andrew parked the truck and walked over to the cans. He removed the note and unfolded it. I put these out early because I wanted to make sure you'd see this, the note began. I'm sorry for what I did. It was wrong, and I know that now. Words don't fix things, but they're a start. There's a coffee gift card inside if you want to talk sometime. The note was signed simply Nancy. Andrew stared at the paper for a long moment, then at the house. The curtains moved slightly. She was watching. He nodded once in acknowledgement, folded the note with the gift card inside, and put it in his pocket. Back in his truck, Andrew sat thinking. He wasn't sure if he'd ever use that gift card. One note didn't erase what had happened or the lifetime of experiences that had come before it. But it was something, a small step. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "How's the route today? Any drama?" He smiled slightly and typed back, "Quieter, but interesting. Tell you later." As he drove away from Maple Street, Andrew thought about the neighborhood meeting, about the note, about all the small ways people could hurt each other and the small ways they could try to heal those hurts. One conversation wouldn't fix everything. One meeting wouldn't transform a community overnight. But maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. 3 months passed. The maple trees along Maple Street had changed from green to brilliant reds and oranges. Life had mostly returned to normal, but normal in Riverside Heights meant something different now. Andrew still drove the same route every Tuesday. These days, more people waved at him. Some even knew him by name. Mr. Wilson often had a cold drink waiting for him. Mrs. Patel occasionally brought out samosas she'd made the night before. Small gestures, but they mattered. One cool autumn morning, Andrew was emptying trash cans when he noticed a small group gathering in the community park at the end of the street. Curious, he finished his work on that block, then drove to the park and parked his truck. As he approached, he recognized many familiar faces: Dr. Thompson, Lily and her golden retriever, the Wilsons, Mr. Garcia and his nephew, and about 20 other neighbors. They were setting up tables, unfolding chairs, hanging colorful signs. One large banner read Riverside Heights Neighbor Day. Lily called when she spotted him. "You made it just in time. We're almost ready to start." "Start what?" Andrew asked, looking around at the activity. "First monthly Neighbor Day," Dr. Thompson explained, joining them. "After everything that happened, we realized many of us had lived side by side for years without really knowing each other. So we decided to fix that. The concept was simple. Once a month, neighbors would gather in the park to share food, stories, and skills. Today, Mr. Reynolds was teaching a small group how to play chess. Mrs. Wilson had set up a table where she was showing children how to make friendship bracelets. Mr. Garcia's nephew, who worked as a mechanic, was giving tips on basic car maintenance to anyone interested. "This all came from that meeting?" Andrew asked, surprised by how much had changed. "That meeting was just the beginning," Dr. Thompson said. "It woke us up. Made us realize a neighborhood isn't just houses on the same street. It's people who look out for each other, who know each other's names and stories." "Speaking of which," Lily said, nodding toward the far side of the park. Andrew followed her gaze and saw Nancy setting up a table. She looked different somehow, her posture less rigid, her movements less hurried. She was arranging flowers in small vases. "She's been taking those community relations workshops," Dr. Thompson explained, noting Andrew's surprise. "Hasn't missed a single one. She's different now. Not completely changed. That takes time. But trying. That counts for something." Andrew nodded slowly. He'd seen Nancy on his route over the past months. They hadn't spoken beyond brief hellos, but the tension had gradually eased. The coffee gift card she'd left him had sat unused in his wallet for weeks before he finally decided to stop by the cafe one day. She hadn't been there, which was probably for the best. He wasn't sure what he would have said. "We were hoping you might want to join us today," Lily said, "not as the garbage man, but as a neighbor." Andrew checked his watch. "I've still got half my route to finish." "After work then," Dr. Thompson suggested. "We'll be here until sunset. Bring your family if you'd like." Andrew considered it. His son had been curious about this neighborhood ever since Andrew had told him about what happened. Maybe it would be good for him to see how things had changed. "I might do that," he said finally. "Thanks for the invitation." As Andrew turned to go back to his truck, he noticed Nancy looking in his direction. After a brief hesitation, she raised her hand in a small wave. Andrew returned the gesture, then continued on his way. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Andrew returned to the park with his son Tyler. The 14-year-old had been skeptical about spending the evening with a bunch of strangers, but the promised food had convinced him. They walked among the tables, meeting people, sampling dishes from different households. Tyler gravitated toward a group of teens who were playing a card game. Within minutes, he was laughing and talking as if he'd known them for years. Andrew found himself at the flower arranging table, where Nancy was teaching a young girl how to trim stems at an angle. "Makes the flowers drink better," she was explaining. "They last longer that way." When she saw Andra, she straightened up. "You came back," she said simply. Andra nodded. Seemed like something worth checking out. An awkward silence stretched between them. "I like what you've done with these," Andra said finally, gesturing to the flower arrangements. "Thank you," Nancy replied. "I'd always loved gardening, but I never thought to share it before." She paused, then added, "Your son." Andrew looked over to where Tyler was now explaining some card game rule to the other teens, his hands moving animatedly. "Yeah, that's Tyler. He wasn't sure about coming, but looks like he's changed his mind." Nancy smiled slightly. "It's easier for kids sometimes. They don't have all the—" She trailed off. "Baggage," Andrew suggested. "History," Nancy corrected. "They don't have all the history." As the evening continued, more connections formed across the park. Mr. Garcia's nephew discovered that Mrs. Patel's daughter was interested in automotive engineering. Dr. Thompson learned that Mr. Wilson had once been a professional jazz musician. Lily found out that several neighbors were interested in setting up a dog walking group. Small bridges being built, piece by piece. When it was time to leave, Tyler was exchanging phone numbers with his new friends, making plans to meet up again. Andra found Dr. Thompson to thank her. "This was good," he said simply, "what you've started here." Dr. Thompson smiled. "It's not just me, it's all of us deciding to do better, to be better." As Andra and Tyler walked back to their car, the autumn air crisp around them, Tyler asked, "So this is where it all happened? Where that lady called the cops on you?" Andra nodded. "This is the place." Tyler looked back at the park, where neighbors were packing up tables, sharing leftovers, saying warm goodbyes. "Doesn't seem like the same place from how you described it." "It's not," Andra said thoughtfully. "It's really not." And that, perhaps, was the most important change of all.